can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Gordon MacLelland. Gordon is the founder and owner of an education programme known as Working with Parents in Sport. Gordon, I suppose rather than me trying to introduce what you guys do, firstly, how are you? And it's great to have you, but I'd really love to know straight off the bat, what is Working with Parents in Sport? What do you do?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Great to be here. I recently got asked that, so I actually know the answer to it because I didn't actually know when I was asked originally. I think what it's become is how do we all work best together so that young people fulfil their potential both in and out of sport. And we work across every strand from recreational all the way through to the highest levels of performance in, football academies, Olympic programs, rugby pathways, cricket pathways, hockey pathways. We've got a whole sort of vaster experience of working across that. And what's become really clear is everybody's got to work together and everybody has a role. I include the children in that, the young people, obviously the role of the parents in terms of the influence that they have. What are the role in coaches in bringing it all together? Coaches and parents can often be two of the most important people in young people's lives. We need them working together rather than pulling in different directions. And then, what's the role of the organisation in making sure that these relationships positive and healthy ones. So it's become very much working across all those strands and the relationship piece. And I guess trying to make sense of what it looks like in the real world for people who are actually having those interactions. It's proper real life stuff, I like to say it as.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just straight away, and actually before we came on, that's one of the things I was really excited about was from own development, selfishly speaking, because I think as coaches, our approach to parents is often, it's very standoffish at times. It can be. At times we want it to be closer, but again, there's just constant tensions and almost the appearance of contradictions in what we want versus what we assume the parents want. And again, that I think that word assumption is probably quite important there because we do assume a lot, but we don't always know a lot. And you've kind of struck on that, why we need to actually work together. So can we maybe talk a little bit more to that? Why do we need to work together? Why is it not that parents are just, they've got the role, they stay there. Coaches, we've got a role, we stay there. Why do we need to work together?
And I get it from a coach point of view, Mark. I'm not going to claim to be all evangelical here, talking to coaches, because I spent all my coaching career through my 20s thinking I knew absolutely everything and you stay as far away as possible. So I'm not going to claim that I haven't been there either. I think the reality on becoming a parent myself is this idea that if we want young people to thrive, the importance of coach and parents pulling in the same direction becomes really important, because if we're looking at it logically, how can young people thrive if we've got those two people pulling in different directions and then we see those two people contradicting each other? We then seeing those two people with no shared values. And what are young people meant to do with that? Who do they believe? Who do they listen to? And everything that goes with that is a challenge. So I think that we've got to recognise that if we didn't have parents, we wouldn't have anyone to coach. Because the reality is they provide the vast majority of tangible support. If they didn't finance it, if they didn't wash the kit, if they didn't bring the kids, we've got no one to coach in the first place. They provide the vast majority of emotional support to their children, the stuff we don't often see as coaches, the managing disappointment when the kids are upset. It's the most popular workshop we get asked to deliver when parents are given a choice. When their kids are struggling for motivation and they don't want to train, or they're maybe not quite feeling 100%. We never see those interactions as coaches, yet they're going on in the background. But I think if we're talking about pure coaching and pure coaching practice, the fact is if I've got a relationship with a parent, they know their kid better than anybody else. And I know as a teacher, a coach, I wanted to know if a child was maybe being bullied or had lost confidence or was struggling, because I may change my coaching practice. Rather than call them out in a big group or whatever else, I spend a bit more time with them beforehand. I might spend a little bit more one time, but I would have that awareness then to make good decisions around that play. And if we're serious about coaching the people in front of us, then obviously that's really important. So yeah, I think there's definitely added value from engaging and bringing them into the process, particularly if they can share our beliefs, values, and reinforce them at home, because we have limited time with the children at any given point in time. Most of the time is still spent at home.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, there's two things around that stands out to me. I suppose there's the first element of about maintenance of our own coaching process before we get into how actually parents can enhance it, but the maintenance of it. I mean, a lot of the research today is showing, if we're thinking about things like motivation and the approach that players take to why they participate and how they approach things, if it's about winning or if it's about trying to get better. And I think more or less the studies are showing that, the parents' influence will always outweigh the coach's influence, no matter what, the coach is trying to do. Now, so that then in turn means that, the parents could unravel a lot of the good work of coaches. However, if we look at this at a more positive standpoint, the parents could reinforce the work that coaches do. And again, I think I'm always seeing it from how do we look at that? It's the perspective we take around that as a starting point. You said yourself there too around, the parents can be a real resource. And if we're thinking about what the needs of the kids are, and you'd referenced about, if they're having struggles at school and stuff like that, I'm starting to see it more and more like, where else will a coach in a community or even within like an academy or whatever the sport is, where else can they find a 24/7 sort of player welfare officer if it's not the parent? Because, that's that person who can provide that around the clock eye on a kid and really help the coach to understand the child's needs. But I suppose it always comes back to is the coach open to that help? Because I think, and this is a bit of an insight, I suppose, into our mentality, and I'm aware you've coached yourself, as you said, Gordon. Like, I think we're very insecure about allowing people in and sharing power, and I think that's something as coaches, I know I need to get better, but a lot of coaches do.
Yeah,
that insecurity.
I think there's two. Yeah, and I think there's two things behind that. I think there's obviously maybe that little bit of coach insecurity. I mean, it's no different to when Ofsted used to come into schools and inspect us. You could be the best teacher in the world, and you're suddenly sent into a whole amount of doubt that somebody's coming in to judge you and do it. Yet we've got coaches who are being judged every single week for multiple training sessions and matches at a weekend. I think when you look back at general coach relationship, and I speak to younger coaches, they're not tarnished by the beliefs that you and I have or experience. Because what happens is no coach sets out to have a bad relationship with parents. However, the moment that we get the problem parent, the group of parents that cause problems on the sides for us, who maybe stir up negative challenges around our coaching, maybe send us the late night email full of Sauvignon Blanc telling us what we've got wrong, it then becomes far easier, because it's human nature just to say, actually, do you know what? I'll do this. You just stay well out of the way there, because actually I feel safer over here. And you can absolutely see why, why that happens and why that materializes. So I think it comes from a point of two things. You've got that going on. And then also there is definitely this fear, and I see this working across the academy landscape as well, that if we give parents a voice and let them in, or if we give the children a voice, and this is why I think it's got lost in translation, it does not mean that they're in charge. Just because we've opened the door, and the problem is, you know what it's like, the world of media, social media, give parents a voice, give children a voice. And what we're now left with is coaches who have no voice and no power. And coaches say, well, that was madness. That wasn't the problem. The problem was we weren't giving them any voice or any choice, any voice to speak up with concerns, with challenges, with all the other bits if they wanted to question things. We weren't bringing kids into the coaching practice and getting their input about what they were trying to achieve and what that looked like. It wasn't open the door for them, oh, and actually, by the way, you've just lost complete control. And I think it's giving coaches and programs the beliefs that actually, no, it's a key part of it. However, we can still set boundaries, values, how we want it to be, because that's what we do in this environment. Just needs to be really well thought out and well communicated.
So it's the tensions then, isn't it? It's just tensions again, because I think if we're trying to get this message across to coaches, I think we're more open to appreciating there are things that are never fully one way or another, that we constantly have to handle tensions in our practice, tensions in skill acquisition, tensions in sometimes the micropolitics of being inside that environment, and this is again one of them. Before then, we perhaps touch on solutions and how we can, which I'm really keen to know from yourself, Gordon, what can make for a functional relationship. But I think actually it'd been useful to touch on and maybe stick with this idea of tensions, because tensions are contextual. What has been your experience of the different types of tensions that exist in the parent-coach relationship across maybe a community sports setting or within a performance sports setting? Or actually, am I kind of trying to pick at things and maybe there's more universal challenges here? I just wonder, is that something that's worth touching on here?
I think there's a difference, obviously, between the two settings in terms of level of expectation and maybe what control you actually have over an environment. If we're running a performance pathway or a football academy, we've almost got a captive audience almost as a starting point, which I do think it makes it easier then to reinforce values and beliefs. The people are more invested. They aren't going to do something completely outrageous that's going to jeopardize their child's what the program that they're in. And whereas in the community game, sometimes, we've got the whole cross section of society. They're not necessarily as invested in their kids. It's just something that they maybe do. Maybe some are invested, but I think also because they don't then get all of those levels of support that maybe certain parents or coaches get maybe in performance things, I think then there's an awful lot of, I don't really know what's going on here. What should I be doing? Where do I get any support from if I do want to learn more? And I think then in the community sports space, we get a lot of behaviours that are basically, well, this is what happens on TV, so I'm just going to copy and paste it. Because that's how we develop young people. That's how we support. That's because it's sport. Surely that means that's what we do. And all we've got to do is use the same language, same behaviours, and if it's good enough for the pros, then actually it'll be good enough for the groups. And actually the whole thing backfires, because it's a totally different thing, whether in an academy environment or even a community environment, and how we develop young players.
Yeah, no, I can totally understand that. I think that's true in so many ways about community sport. There's just a lack of structure. It's a lack of structure for the coaches, and again, this is where some things just collide. Because on the one side, the parents are maybe not too sure about what they should be doing, or indeed maybe they aren't as engaged at that point yet in terms of their level of involvement. They'll then contrast that with the person that's in front of them that probably is a parent themselves, but they're being left to deal with the session and they're trying to figure out so many things, and then it's like, you know, the parent becomes yet another thing they need to try and learn on the job, because there's just never is enough structure for coaches in the community. And then I totally also see that idea within performance settings where the parents are invested, they are engaged. Not always, and again, I suppose the stereotype isn't not always, but that over investment then can in turn be about, well, we're trying to get you to lay off, or at least to know how to direct that energy, that brilliant energy you've got, in a way that's more conducive. So it's just different. It's different, I suppose. So yeah, we could either touch, and I suppose, I mean, my personal background just came within performance sport, and I'd be interested in knowing your perspective around how you would handle parents then, let's say in a more formal environment where there is capacity to do workshops and there is capacity to educate. And again, I say that word deliberately because I know that you have a slightly different approach to that word, educate. How do we work with parents in that setting? Because it's highly emotional. It's always emotional anyway, but there's also a pathway for the parents that they see their child going on, and that just creates a lot of issues and a lot of stereotypes that the parents also buy into. You mentioned about how coaches, we have a subculture of anti-parent, which we buy into. The parents probably have a subculture of anti-coaches. Now, I'm contextualising this almost to football, because there's always the bad football academy, label. Parents buy into that. We both go into the relationship with each other expecting things to happen, and they probably make them happen because we're trying to confirm our own bias.
Yeah.
And that creates such a complicated starting point, because that's the hard part. What's your experience been with that?
Well, I mean, I think we found that parents we're playing out to packed houses at the moment. Parents genuinely love some support, and genuinely want to do what's best for their kids. Traditionally, the narrative around working with parents or educating parents is we put an adult at the front, tell them what they should be doing because this is what we want, and don't give them any hints and tips, and we're very good at doing the information dump and the logistics. Oh, well done, we've done an induction and we've worked with parents. Well, hang on, it's far more complicated than that. I can tell you that now. And I think the complexities of being a sports parent as well is the support needs to be in understanding your child, understanding the wider things of the program, understanding how we develop young high performers, so that not just are they brilliant at the sport, but they're brilliant people as well. So they've got the traits that hold them together. We're helping these young people understand why they're winning and why they're being successful, not necessarily the outcomes per se. But that educating and engaging piece is fascinating, because I can tell you now that if I'd gone around the world talking to the many parents I have, and I turned up with the attitude that I'm here to educate you and I'm greater than you are, I wouldn't have got out of some of the places I've spoken in. And that's me being very honest. So I'm very aware that when I look at where the engagement's been good, it's been very real in its delivery. It's had humour. It's had me constantly admitting my own fails as a sports parent on a regular basis, even though I live and breathe this, because the reality is it's such a hard job. You are not always going to get it right. That there's an opportunity for them to talk themselves in those sessions, that they're able to share bits and pieces on a variety of different topics and what they're seeing. And ultimately, I would never say, because you've talked about context, and I think this is the really important thing, is that every family is going to be different. Every sporting environment is going to be different. Yes, there's going to be some general themes. For me, the magic's working within that environment within that little ecosystem, and then working with the people in there to reinforce values, behaviors, how we develop young people, but doing it because we know more, so we become more self-aware, not because we've been told to do this. Actually, what we've done is, if we're saying we want our young people to fulfill their potential, are our behaviours and actions around the support we give them, does that reflect that? Or are we hitting it? And as you say, not saying that's what you should do. It's like, oh yeah, God, maybe I could be a little bit better there on the car journey. Oh yeah, trying to have those difficult conversations, but they're just blowing up in my face at the wrong times. How do I manage disappointment? What does my role modelling and body language look like? What are my dreams? What are my kids' dreams? What can we expect? What can't we expect? I mean, how the hell are you meant to make sense of that? When I'm relying on a sports science degree, 25 years of coaching, coaching, working in education, and I've got 2 kids in performance sport. And I struggle to make sense of it and spend my whole life trying to make sense of it for people. So how we expect other people just to piece it all together, I don't know.
And maybe that, there was a few things I wanted to come back to in what you said there, but that last point, it's funny because coaches, we treat players' development as a lifelong journey. We treat our own development as coaches as a lifelong journey, but we probably expect parents to just get it right away. Like, in terms of we do the workshop, this is how the academy, we're trying to do all the things that I think you've alluded to that are conducive. If as a starting point, at least about transparency. Here's our coaching process. This is what we do. This is the behaviours that you'll see. This is why they're happening. And I think that in turn is good because then parents understand it, and it probably allows an opening to understand that we both want the same thing. I don't ever actually met a parent that doesn't want their kid to sometimes experience some tough times and to build character. It's not as if parents are anti that. I think sometimes it's that parents don't always understand that coaches are being deliberate in their behaviours and that they're, where maybe, this week we are going to tell the kids to try and win, and it's not because we care about winning, but we're trying to put a pressure on them and then see how they handle it. Parents just want to be in the loop. I think in that scenario, that's good, and I think it's where they are unsure and they're like, is this meaningful, good, intentional behaviour, or is this someone just being cruel to my Wayne? And that's always a difficult thing. But we'll return to this. The reason I say that is that we're seeing this as part of how the parenting help with the kids' long-term developmental journey. But the parents need to learn, and they need to be allowed to make mistakes, and they need to be allowed to become more and more self-aware. And in that space, that's where we need a bit of patience, because it's tough. Parents are handling more things than we handle probably with that child.
But it's not what I found, Mark, and I say I live and breathe this and talk about it all the time. Yeah, I mess it up with my 2 kids every single week. Don't try and label me that I'm a good parent, a bad parent, a helpful parent, an unhelpful parent, because I'll openly tell you now I'm all 4 of them. Depending on what mood I'm in and what other things have gone on and everything else. And am I more self-aware? Yes, of course I am. Do I have some better ideas than I did when my kids first started? Yes, of course. Have I got all the answers? Absolutely not. Do I still mess it up? Absolutely. But then the other side of that, as your kids get older as well, is the role starts to evolve a little bit anyway, and it changes. And some of the things that, when you're talking to parents of 9-year-olds at the start of the journey compared to talking to parents of 15 and 16-year-olds, you're talking a whole different ballgame. But then their kids are totally different as well. They've gone from being human beings to the most unhuman creatures in the world in some cases. So I just think it's a fascinating piece. I just don't know how we expect parents to be brilliant at how they support the kids, because I just don't think.
And the extent of and I suppose the extent of the support we give them sometimes is these workshops, and this is something I'm curious about, because I think I see a lot of use in workshops, provided they form part of a wider curriculum of work, and provided they are part of a more constant interaction between the person who is developing the other person and that person who's wanting to be developed. Because again, we wouldn't expect our own players, and we wouldn't expect our own self to be able to cultivate the skill sets in a 45-minute meeting. We expect them to be practicing it, to make mistakes. So is it about not treating, because that's where I wonder, workshops, can they sometimes be a bit of a plaster approach? I wonder if the workshops, do they need to come alongside continual work and engagement and interaction? Because again, this is a bit of a confessional tale. I'm always very caught up in my own coaching process, and I know a lot of coaches similar to myself, where they do what they need to do when they need to do it, and then it's like, right, training started, just get out of the way. And at the end of the session, it's almost a bit of an avoidance, and it's almost like, and it's like, this is more time. They're observing things.
Yeah.
Are you taking time to help see if they are seeing things correctly, working on what maybe the workshop's starting?
Yeah, I think it's got, as I said at the very beginning, it comes from, you've got to target everything. You can't just deliver a session to parents and say that you're expecting this, this and this, and then coach behaviours look exactly the opposite of that. Likewise, you can't have a club saying this is what we value, these are our behaviours, this is what you'll expect to see here. If then you go round and basically the coaches behave as though we've got 10 different clubs in one club, because one coach is doing it. Well, I'm not talking about coaching styles here. Everybody's going to be different on that, and that's brilliant. I'm talking about the values, behaviours, the things we're reinforcing, the things that we expect from the people around those groups need to be really, really aligned. And then I think we can be more demanding of parents. We can then, but we've got to get our houses in order first from a coach point of view, our role modeling point of view, a values point of view within the environment. And then we can start be demanding of the kids and the parents, because it's very clear and it's consistent. And you've alluded to it as well, that a lot of the worst behaviours come when either a parent is shocked by something that they see and they're not expecting it, or they don't know what's going on. And of course, what happens when they don't know what's going on is they try to join up their own dots. And then you'll have seen it around toxic gymnastics balconies, swimming balconies, football pitches. Then what you get is somebody with no expert opinion who puts across their point of view. And that point of view suddenly becomes the gospel. And then somebody else tells somebody else. And suddenly it's like, well, who told you that? Where's that narrative come from? But that narrative comes about in the first place because we haven't painted the picture well enough. We know those pressure points as coaches. We know when we're going to try and do things that are going to throw kids off. We know when we might play them out of position. We know that it's good to have parent-free events on some days because you're trying to foster independence, children not being reliant on the parents, understanding that it's them having the agency and developing those skills. Fine, we try to do those things, but we never communicate it well enough.
It's the communication.
And it just causes a problem. So it still goes back to that too. Really great communication, aligned objectives, some kind of relationship between coaches and the parents, and it's a two-way process. And there's regular updates, but not, God, I don't want coaches to think, oh, Gordon, you're a nightmare because I haven't got the time to do that. I'm also realistic. I'm not talking about 20-minute chats every week with every player. But, if it's, you can be creative. Yes, you can do your beginning of season thing. You can maybe do a mid-season thing with parents. You can maybe once every 6 weeks bring them onto the side of your field to listen to the team talk at the end. What have you been working on? What you've been working on next? When you see a parent, don't ignore them. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for bringing them. Not you have to have a coaching debrief, but that whole relationship side of things and the trust that it reinforces and those things, I think are just all valuable traits that everybody needs.
I really like what you were saying there, Gordon, actually, around bring them closer to where you're coaching so that they can hear, and therefore that might actually, if it's not about preventing, and maybe again this is the wording and this is where you're saying the coach aspect, that not prevent a conversation need to be had. It's not as if conversations that need to be prevented, but where a picture can say 1,000 words. because I know that this is another thing that coaches are always worried about. As soon as you start talking to a parent and you try and open up that communication stream, it's like a leaky tap and it won't stop, and then you'll start getting texts, and it's not through the parents, it's not through them meaning it, but then all of a sudden they're like, right, I can chat to Mark anytime I want now. And this is hard, even if you're not even if you're in a professional setting and coaching, but in a community setting as well. You don't have time, and that's another reason. But what you're giving there is a very tangible solution, actually, of just allow them to be closer to what you do. And just really, I think what parents have got is not as a natural distrust, but they want to always know their kids getting looked after. And that's like, look, this, you want an audit? This is a free audit. You can see everything that we do. It's where we try and cover things up and hide things, and not even maliciously, but we just don't let them in. We're actually making the need for more conversations when they perhaps don't need to have that much of a chat with us. They maybe don't really want to, but they feel they need to if we haven't spoke at all or haven't shown them enough. And I think that really resonates, actually.
Yeah, and that bit you're talking about there, you know, bringing them closer, is it allows them to see your role modelling, it allows to see what you're valuing, it allows them to see your behaviours, and it allows them to pick up the conversation with their kids afterwards and at home. I think the relationship point of view, you're right, absolutely right about parents. I mean, we're an absolute nightmare. You know, we suddenly get invited into a conversation, and then suddenly, bang, you know, I've been talking to academy staff about this. Good morning, good afternoon, how are you? And then suddenly, why is my son not doing this? Why is my daughter not playing in that position? Why did she only play 30 minutes last week and not the full game? And suddenly then coaches get caught with, oh my God, what do I say? And they end up saying things that actually they probably shouldn't. And I think then it goes back to, actually, I've been caught on the hook here. I need to be aware of this. I don't want to get caught like this, but I am going to have decent common decency to have a basic conversation. We've been working in a lot of clubs where that then goes back to, what's your communication policy as a club, as an environment? If we're wanting a lengthy football dialogue, that doesn't happen on the way to the car as you're putting the balls in the boot. If we're wanting to have a difficult or crucial conversation about a child, there is a process to go through where you have that chat face to face, and we can all convey empathy and everybody can see what everybody means. When we're just talking about the realities of a normal week, we're just trying to give them little snippets of information, either by, as you say, like by bringing them closer, acknowledging that they exist. You know, it's not difficult even then, is it, Mark, to walk and say, good evening, thanks for bringing him. I thought he did that well tonight. End of conversation.
Yeah, I know, totally.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be any more. Could do that for 20 players and it takes me 2 minutes. And
I know, and if you're not even just doing, if it's not even you need to directly speak to them, make a point during the session of praising wee Timmy or, you know, Lucy, or like be open and more vocal than perhaps you normally have to be for the kids to hear, but for the parents to hear you about something that's to do with the values you're setting. Guys, the reason we don't give up now is we want to take on challenges, and you're saying it doubly loud, and it's just for the parents' benefit. And again, it's like, right, now they understand that, and even if they don't agree with it, at least now, if anything, it primes the conversation better and it makes just everything more efficient. See, one of the words that you've said, John, as well, is awareness, and actually, I think this is, as coaches, we need to be self-aware. I always see one of the biggest parts about a coach's development, I think, is always self-awareness of their own behaviours. And again, this is where we need to see parents, I think, as a resource for that, because so many things can impact our behaviours in terms of in a match day at training, things that happen before you've arrived, things that happen at the time, the needs of the situation, and that again is a fluid sort of dynamic. But all the time as coaches, not always if you work, I suppose, in an individual sport like tennis, but I'm thinking that maybe more so like invasion type sports, or sports where you're having to watch so many people. There's only one person that's probably able to afford to watch one person all the time, and that's a parent. And what an eyesight that is. A parent can watch their own child constantly, and they can make, and again, I suppose this comes down to, as coaches, do we want to learn. And I think every coach says they want to learn, but coaches aren't always good at learning where they're given criticism or where there's an outside opinion that maybe is trying to be critical of what they're doing, because a parent can see that, when you turn away from their kid, that there's an expression on their kid's face that you might par away and say, "Oh, I'm trying to deal with so many people at one time," but you do need to know that, and again, that's one person in a coaching environment that will be able to tell them things that goes beyond the whole, I don't know, the rhetoric of what coaching's meant to be, and it's about the skill and the technique. It's about dealing with people ultimately and working with kids and caring for kids, and you're going to have that as a parent. And again, coaches need to utilise that. They need to build self-awareness, and I just see that again we need to use that as a tool. It's such a potent tool.
Yeah, I just want to go back. You said something that was brilliant, because it's well worth sharing this story, for the one about when parents and you watch your own kid. Okay, so coaches are watching everybody. As a parent, you heavily watch your own. And I'll never forget, so Sarah Murray, who wrote our sports performance parenting book with me, Sarah's worked in some amazing performance environments. And she said to me, she said, "Gordon, how often do you watch your child's game?" I said, "Well, every weekend, Sarah, you know that. If I'm not working, I absolutely love it. I can't wait to get there." And she said, "No, how often do you watch the game?" And I'm thinking, oh no, Sarah's far too bright to be asking me that. I'm walking into something here. And I said, "Well, I've just said that every week." She said, "No, tell me this." She said, "What do you do when you go and watch Liverpool?" I said, "Well, I have a few drinks, sing You'll Never Walk Alone, and I have a good day out." And she knew I was being flippant, because I knew I was in trouble. And she said, "Tell me this then." She said, "Do you watch Virgil van Dijk for 90 minutes or do you watch the ball?" And I said, "Well, I watch the ball." And she said, "Do you do that when you're watching your kids?" She said, "You'll be there, you'll be watching every interaction, every behaviour, feeling it with them, every mistake they make. You won't have any balanced perspective of what else is going on with everybody else. You'll be laser focused on your kid." She said, "I bet you're doing that all the time. Your old coaching hat will be on." She said, "You won't be able to resist it." And I thought, oh no. And I said, "Okay, yeah, you've got me. Hands up, definitely do that." And then we thought, well, how do we bring this to life for parents in terms of what they're seeing when they watch? So we actually went to the Premier League and took a few stats from a period of time. And Harry Kane was scoring 1 in 4.5 shots, and Mo Salah was dribbling the ball 8 times and losing it 4. Could you imagine the kittens that young sports parents would be having on those percentage success rates, 25% and 50%? It'd be causing a heart attack to parents. Yet we don't pick it out off the TV when they're doing that. You dig a little bit deeper, because we've got this idea that we're going to watch and it has to look perfect all the time and it's going to be brilliant. So I think that ramps up expectations and behaviours, but actually the false expectations, because particularly with football, it's a game of interactions where there's got to be a whole host of different things going on.
Should coaches then? I'm wondering, again, is maybe one little solution of an array of loads of other solutions that need to happen at one time as well. But is an easy win perhaps in some way getting parents to start to consciously look outside of their own child on the game day? Is that something that you see? Because I'm wondering, would that have, put my coach's hat on here, is that, I could imagine that would have a bit of utility in understanding maybe the dynamics of the game better, understanding maybe the kids' wider contribution or actually maybe lack thereof towards the team, because again, we're always, there's that sort of goggle effect, isn't there? Of, they see, my wee boy's just not had the ball passed to him, but it's actually like, if you're able to see what other players are doing and you start to watch what your own child's doing in relation to them, you might then start to go, actually, maybe he needs to be a wee bit higher up. This is maybe why the coach is saying that, because, we're now seeing them as a whole, as part of a team.
Or they're playing on the worst pitch in the world, and the centre-halves have decided they're not going to play out from the back because this is just a nightmare. And you're never going to get it, so you'll be bypassed. Yeah, and look, I think it's a good way. I think that one of the better ways of introducing that more, because I think it's a difficult, trait to break, because I've still been honest. I mean, I'm probably still at 80% of that. When Sarah got me, I was probably at 90, but I'm still pretty high up on it. I think that it's better almost to do with it training. I'll never forget watching a coaching session many years ago. It was in an academy environment. My son was in it, and there were a lot of mistakes. And I was watching, as you do, and I was sort of heading my hands like I am now, and I was getting a bit hot under the collar because it just didn't look right. I was getting a bit frustrated with the mistakes he was making. And I sort of took a breath and started thinking about coaching in general and what I thought about the session. Now, obviously, I had that experience to draw. And when I started to watch everybody, there were mistakes galore. It was clearly a new concept. It was clearly something the kids hadn't seen. And the whole thing was littered with mistakes. It wasn't just my child. Mm. So as I walked off at the end of the session, and actually it got better and the session was actually quite good. And I thought, it's quite cool there. There's quite a lot of learning gone on. But it took me quite a while to get to that. I just made that. And as I walked down, I was met by a group of parents who said, Gordon, load of rubbish that tonight. I said, what do you mean load of rubbish? So it was just awful. Did you watch it? I said, well, yeah. I said, but did you see that they've never done it before and how many mistakes they all made? And actually it got better.
Yeah.
Oh, no. But their assumption was because they'd seen mistakes and because they'd seen messiness, that it was the worst session that had ever been put on. But yet from a coaching perspective, I'm looking at it thinking that was absolutely brilliant. I didn't obviously know what the set objectives were, and I was drawing on an awful lot of my own experience in sport to come up with the conclusion that I did. However, that was the reality of it. So what they'd seen, what they were expecting to see, what they believed, what they were actually taking in was very different from the reality of it.
And maybe that's something as well that we can deepen the conversation. It shouldn't just be about giving parents an insight into our game model, our coaching process and in terms of what we do and how we try and play, but do parents actually understand the difference between learning and performance? And because we as coaches we live on that, and that's something we're so clear on, that if you want performance, we can do the same thing in a way that's very easy to get better in at the time, but it doesn't have the best transference then to the match. Therefore, we need to fail more in training in order to succeed longer term. And our parents, and again, it doesn't, and I'm saying it's not necessarily again about, I'm starting to learn that through this conversation, that it's not necessarily about, getting them in a workshop and we have to have this PowerPoint slide on that. But again, if they're close, they're in our proximity, are we relaying messages to, one, reinforce it to our players, who are first and foremost the main point of attention, but are we talking to the kids actually and around the parents and helping the parents understand why? Don't worry about the fact that we're failing and make it very clear that we're working on something new. Yeah. And then in match day, again, I think that's something that a lot of time clubs will operate off that, where they'll go through lots of training at doing different things. And it's like, if this is the first week that we have worked on this new way of building out from the back, the training game is not going to work very well. The match day certainly isn't going to work very well. And even if it does work well, that's more coincidental. That doesn't always, again, say that we're doing learning. But again, show the parents this through having them close to us, letting them hear what we're saying, and then if at the very least it gives them some sense of understanding, and then if we need to clarify it further, we can do that in another space. I want to also touch on something with you, Gordon, that I'm really keen on, because you'd mentioned about the time and place to have difficult conversations, because this is the reality is we're never going to set up. I've never experienced before in my life an entirely harmonious relationship between a parent and a coach. And I don't think that should be expected, because parents are emotional monsters. They have to be. That's their wee baby. Their whole job in life is to look after a child. Particularly when we see sports never going to please everyone all the time. Even in a community setting, there's going to be times where kids play more than others, less. They have good games. There's behaviours that from the coach in the sideline that parents agree with, they don't agree with. In an academy setting, it's even worse, where there's progression, there's deselection. So there's going to be times where there's disagreements. How do we, when things just don't go right, where we need to have the difficult conversations, how should we approach them? So one of the things you've already given is there's a time to maybe remove ourselves from the direct, immediate emotionality of that situation. So maybe it's about having the meeting a couple of days later, or even at a time where we can both be more relaxed.
Yeah.
But
Oh,
if we're
yeah.
sitting in there, how do we? That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that conversation is going to be any easier.
No.
What are some of the things when you've got an angry parent, a disgruntled parent, that we can do as coaches that is about de-escalation, that, you know, that helps us, even if we're not going to turn out at the end of that meeting still agreeing with each other, we might disagree still. How do we manage that? Because that's the space that I think, going back to what we spoke about earlier, we don't forget things easily, and it only takes one bad experience with a parent, and I've been there loads of times, like really bad experiences,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
then meet you and use that to tar every other parent that comes forward. So I think that would be a really useful space at the end of this conversation to be start thinking about how do we manage these situations. That's the hard part
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah. Absolute nightmare. We were talking about yesterday a Premier League club and just the toll it takes on people doing the deselection. And we were just having a chat about, you know, we've run a few case studies, different scenarios that we've seen in different clubs and, you know, different methods of delivering bad news, for example, and different ways of going about it. And actually, it's just about having a good chat because, as you say, certainly for us as coaches, because actually you're never going to be anybody's Christmas card list when you say something bad about their kids or you deselect them. It's going to be very, very challenging. I think that it goes back to how do we communicate as a club-wide policy that's very clear at the beginning of the season. Because we can do the managing a disagreement, disgruntlement, upset. This is what we'd like as a club policy. Because what we don't want is that incident to happen in front of other parents, in front of other coaches, and particularly in front of the players. Because if we have that dialogue, we're weakening all the potential future relationships between those people. And when we are in that frame of mind, or there's Dr. Steve Peters called chimp mode, and we're slightly irrational, and we all know what it's like when we get to that stage, we could end up saying things that ultimately we're responsible for saying them, but we're not really in control of it. And that could be talked about well before any disagreement happens. I think the challenge comes then is that the gap, the 24, 48 hours in an ideal world is everybody gets a chance to calm down. But actually, I think you go home as a parent or as a coach, and actually that's really difficult because you can't wait that long and you're desperate to deal with it. And I've spoken to a lot of parents who then got on the email, had a few drinks, and fired off the worst email that's ever been sent. And, you know, I've been on the receiving end of those as well, telling me I'm the worst person ever to be involved in the sports system. I had plenty of those in my coaching career. And then you can get caught potentially in a game of email ping pong with no empathy, no emotion, because you're not doing it face to face and words can be severely misinterpreted.
Yeah.
So I think from a coach perspective and a club perspective, I think we have to be very clear about what we're trying to do around moments of upset, disappointment, disagreement. I think that's then very different when we get to a safeguarding issue or a bullying issue, because you deal with that there and then, because that's the nature of what it is. You're just going to have to do the right things. I think then when we have created that bit of space, that we then have I always think for difficult conversations and crucial conversations is that we're talking face to face, that we can convey feeling, we can convey empathy. But we've thought through what we're going to say. We've got the evidence for how we've seen it. I think the key then is we also have the ability to let the parents speak about how they've seen it, whether or not we agree. Because the easiest thing at that stage then, and I know it is, and I've done this plenty of times myself, is to sit there and as they're talking, all I'm thinking is, you're talking a load of rubbish, how do I defend myself?
You're trying to win an argument. Yeah, and it's like,
Yeah,
what's the
I'm not
goal of
actually
the conversation?
No,
What is the
I'm
goal?
not actually listening. I'm just doing it. And the reality is that everybody has different perspectives thing. I think our role as a coach then is to stick with what we think, see, maybe acknowledge that parents, and actually, do you know what? Sometimes the parents talk a lot of sense. Think back to my time in education, the parent used to say, Gordon, I think you've got that completely wrong. And I was never never magnanimous when I was younger to say, yeah, I think I have, I'll change it. I did change it the following year when they weren't around and did it differently. And that's the benefit of hindsight and being able to admit your mistakes as you get a bit older. But I think our ability to listen and acknowledge that they feel that they've been heard is a really important part of that dialogue. And as you say, we may still get to a point at the end of all of that where we still disagree. But then I think the next bit, how can we, what's going to be the best path forward? We obviously haven't got to a point of conclusion that we both agree with. What are we going to do and what does that look like? Again, putting the child at the centre of that decision and that choice.
I wonder, is that something that, and I actually think kind of strategically a great way, and again, I don't say this with it, again, we've just touched on that, it's not to try to win an argument, it's actually to try to keep clear head towards what is the goal. When you walk out here, what is the goal? With limited expectations sometimes, and at least in our realistic expectations, it's not about walking away hand in hand, hugging each other, loving each other, but what is the goal of the conversation? And I've found in the past, as soon as you can bring it back to what's best for the child, and very explicitly state that straight away, I think that's what, because that's what the parents care about. Straight away, they want to know that. I think where coaches open up with explaining their behaviours, and I don't mean to say that we can't explain the behaviours, because it's not that the parents are always right. And again, I know I sound like a coach saying that. A lot of times with certain things they aren't. A lot of times with some things they are. But I think, how can you make it personal, particularly if you've had a detached relationship already, where perhaps they only have, because I know some coaches that, the first time they've had a conversation with a parent is when they're deselecting their child.
Yeah,
so they've
and that's,
never had a relationship with them.
Yeah, and that's a problem in any setting. That would be a problem in education, and that's you've hit a majorly key point there. The first bit of contact you have with the parent should not be bad news. Mm-hmm. And you should already have a relationship with them, and you should already know who they are, what their context is, and how they're relating to the kid that you're coaching. And if you've done those little bits we talked about earlier, the good mornings, the good evenings, the acknowledgement and the quick chats and the odd bits done well, actually you're still not going to be on the Christmas card list when you're having the bad news. Mm-hmm. But you're going to have a far better difficult conversation than you would have done, as opposed to what you've just mentioned there.
And I'm thinking as well, but the parent, particularly where sometimes it can't be avoided, where the child's is present in these conversations. Sometimes that isn't what's best for them. Other times it can be, again, if it's a conversation that isn't about deselection, but maybe it's a review process and it's about, and we have to keep it there. But I think as coaches, empathy to understand that the parent has to be seen in front of their child to defend their child, not for their own reasons, in terms of not for their own name, try to win an argument, but to show their child that they care as well. And I think it's similar, like, where I have a player who has been absolutely melted in a tackle, and the referee, for whatever reason, didn't give them a card. I know in the moments when I go up there, I've got empathy for the referee, but I think a referee will understand that I still need to show my player to some extent that I'm angry, because if I don't, and it's like, they then walk away, how does that affect our relationship? So I think there's a little bit of, in the moment, and it may not be that they have to show they're trying to put a front up for their child. It may be that they're putting a front up to some extent for their partner, because remember, parents aren't one person with two heads. It's two people, two different personalities, and maybe that might be something we can finish on, because I'm curious to how do you offset different personalities within that parent group, because parents aren't a person. Sometimes they are, but they aren't a person. There's a mum, there's a dad.
And it goes back to this idea that there's not a one size fits all. And it goes back to this idea, when I work with parents, every family's going to be different. Every relationship's going to be different, whether they're talking car journeys, home, whatever that may be. Societies and cultures are going to be different. I mean, I work in some pathways with no white Caucasians. Well, I'm sorry. Good luck sending some of the messages that we've put out in the westernized world and land those messages with them. It doesn't work. So this whole one size fits all. So, but again, our ability to understand the child, their context, the relationship with the adult that we formed, then gives us the best chance of acting appropriately around the dialogues, because we know something. We know something. We've got a chance at least then. And that's got to be fostered and nurtured just like any other relationship. And I think probably more so, I think this is an easier thing, as I said earlier, needs to become more of a thing in performance sport. I think, yes, you've got to do it in community sport and everybody's doing it. But, we're talking about some coaching traits here that are really skilled traits that take a lot of work, not the poor parent coach who's turning up for 1 hour a week and working their socks off doing their job every week, and then everybody's expecting them to be brilliant. That's not fair. That's not realistic. But I still think that relationship piece, our understanding, our trust, and that bad news piece for me, honesty with empathy is what I talk a lot about with coaches. Honesty based on evidence, but you've got to deliver it with some empathy and understanding of where the other person will be coming from and their reaction. And as I say, God, I've managed to get all right at it with age. But it's.
And I suppose the thing that strikes me there, and it's probably a conversation for another time, but just what you mentioned about cultures. I mean, different cultures, particularly a Western culture, is often very individualistic, meaning that there's more of a incentive or a expectation rather for us to take opinions and for not to control people's behaviour as such, but to be more collaborative. And again, if you can extend that towards then what parents' expectations can be as well. And I don't just mean that in terms of how parents are expecting you to deal with them or deal with a child, but also again, bring them into your process, how a coaching process that is perhaps more individualistic can seem very strange from parents who are coming from a different cultural view of what coaching looks like, what coaching is. To some parents, coaching is a very prescriptive, I want to see you take control of things, and I don't want the player's voice to be that salient. For other players in different cultures, and therefore their parents, there is an expectation. I want my kid to have input. I want to have input as the kid's parent, and I could see a real space there for anyone that's listening to reflect on that. How is not just your coaching assimilating to the culture, but how is your handling of parents within that culture? And are you expecting the culture to assimilate to you? Because that won't happen. Because we have more and more coaches now working abroad.
Yeah.
See this as a challenge and a difference, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, what you're telling me, Mark, that there's not a one size fits all. I think that's your best. I think that's your best message than a lot of the evangelical stuff I see around the world of social media. I'm sorry, it doesn't exist. You can glossy up things all you want, but the reality in the real world is every context different, and it's the skills to be able to pick, choose, learn, reflect, build relationships are the stuff that holds it all together ultimately.
Yeah. And where I suppose if people have got a space that you are trying to listen, rather than, like as you say, kind of appearing a bit vacant or appearing like you're just waiting for someone to show up so you can say your part, can we still, then maybe there are in a very small way some universal truths in that, just try to listen to people and show people you are listening to them. It might be repeating back something someone's just said. It might be maintaining eye contact. Is it things that is in interpersonal skills that we can do in that moment too? I'm conscious of our time gone, so I think, it's absolutely superb. I think your work in general, and I actually want to use the last bit of our time together to kind of let people who aren't as aware of your work know where they can find out more. I mean, you've actually written 4 books, which is incredible in terms of on this topic, but and that in itself, for any coaches listening, should really make you pay attention to just how complicated that role of a parent is, and therefore, the extension of that, how much you should really be paying attention to how you operate within that. You've written books on engaging, and actually how as coaches we can actually work with parents, called the book's called Engage. We've also got a book that I think is of real relevance to coaches, the two hats about if you are a parent coach, you are a parent who's actually coaching your own child. That might be a conversation we can come back to at another time, and I'd love that. That itself, that's even worse. That's even worse.
Absolutely, yeah.
Am I right in saying that certainly as well, what I've been really enjoying doing is you've got your own podcast, Gordon, as well. The podcast is called Working with Parents in Sports Podcast. I was listening to a few episodes quite recently, and as much as that is kind of focusing more on the parent's journey, it does seem like a really great tool, I think, for coaches to listen to further empathise with what parents think and feel and get that inside scoop on that.
Yeah, I think so. And actually, there's a lot of it. You've got a lot of people from different areas of sport, and actually, it's using information and making context specific. You know, I listened to some of that, and I was talking about some of the stuff we'd be talking about parents with yesterday in the club, and actually, the coaches were like, "That's really helped my coaching. I'm going to be thinking about the questions I ask the kids there. I want to be thinking how I'm developing resilience in them and what does it actually look like." So I think there's quite a lot of crossover by the sheer nature, just like we've talked today. We've touched on a bit of parenting coaching, but we've ultimately talked about how do we bed it all together. And yeah, look, I'm very fortunate to host that podcast. We get a lot of good guests on it, and we get through some quite cool topics. And I get to ask the questions that I hope every sports parent wants answers to, because I certainly want answers to them as well and make some sense of them.
Yeah, no, brilliant. And if let's say there's people listening and indeed clubs or organisations, how can they get in touch with yourself, Gordon, and your company? What's the best route towards that?
So if they just go to the website, www.parentsinsport.co.uk, and send me an email on there. And we'd be delighted to pick up any conversations with anybody, and if we can help in any way, of course we will.
Yeah, and very briefly, could you touch what is the different things that you guys offer actually as a company, if there are those who maybe would be interested in a workshop or some sort of resource or some sort of ongoing training? What do you offer?
Yeah, so we do workshops and webinars across a number of different strands for sort of academy management, club staff on building positive parent cultures. We do all the coach education work on how you work with parents from recreational level all the way up through to working with performance coaches at the highest end of sport. We've got the Two Hats Parent Coach book, as you say. That's a challenge in itself, and we've got a workshop around that. And then we've got a whole host of parent workshops for different environments. You know, in our performance spaces, we deliver 6 different workshops to parents through our Any Pathway journey. But we've got a few spin-offs from those as well. I'm currently working on a new one at the moment, which I'm excited with, about working with Generation Z, merging the best of the past to create merging the now with the best of the past to create the best future. And it's absolutely fascinating, but I'm not going to say too much because
I love that.
I think there's going to be a few more conversations that are going to need to be had by everybody in trying to make sense of how we raise young high performers. Otherwise, I think we could be in a bit of a muddle.
Yeah, I love that. And without, I suppose, drawing on that too much, if there's one thing we're talking about how we approach conversations, Generation Z don't approach them like they're a problem, approach them like they're their own people and they have their own solutions. Now that's absolutely superb. I love that there's webinars as well, so I think that would allow people who you're down south yourself, but people that maybe are up north in Scotland or abroad, that they could also participate in some of these opportunities.
And they can book them for their club. You know, they're very popular, our virtual sessions, hours workshop, get all their parents on, all their coaches on, all their parent coaches on, and we just do a session in the comfort of their homes, and it's popular, particularly, as you say, where, you know, we're quite a long way away from certain places around the world.
Amazing. No, thanks so much, Gordon. It's honestly been brilliant talking to you and doing a bit of therapy for myself, as that sort of coaching needs to get better at working with parents as well. So hopefully it's been as useful to everyone that's been listening as it has been to me. But thanks so much, Gordon.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.
And thanks, guys, for listening, and we will see you next time.